Welcome to the Indie by Design podcast, episode 3. This is a show about game design and game designers. This episode features Roll7, creators of the OlliOlli series and Not a Hero. The Indie by Design podcast is brought to you by Stace Harmon and John Robertson. This episode is hosted by me, John Robertson. Stace and I are the writers and creators of Independent by Design, Art and Stories of Indie Game Creation, a book which is available now via our website, indiebydesign.net, or via Amazon. You can follow us on Twitter at Indie by Design, and if you'd like to leave us a review on iTunes or your preferred podcast platform, we'd be very grateful. You likely know Roll7 from Not a Hero and the two OlliOlli games, but the core trio that make up the studio have been working together for a number of years prior to these high-profile releases. They've worked in education, teaching kids, among other things, how to make games, and they've worked on advertising campaigns with a number of recognisable brands, and they've also dabbled in creating games based around brain interface technology. Roll7's three founders, Simon Bennett, Tom Hegarty and John Ribbins, work closely together to create and release their games, but it's John that takes the lead in game design. We begin our interview with him by looking back at his earliest game design experiences.
I first, when I was about 5, so 1990, my dad was a teacher and he brought home an Atari 520 ST from school. There was one they weren't using anymore. And we had that at home and it was in my room. And we had a big disc box full of games, which I now realise were all pirated games. But there were a couple of kids in one of the classes my dad taught who were really into games, and they used to give him floppy disks and be like, oh, your son will like this or whatever. So didn't know it at the time, but they were just ripping games, right? But at some point I ended up with a floppy disk that had BASIC on it, where you can just type in, go to line 1, print hello, and it puts hello on the screen and whatever. And so I used to play around with that. And I think kind of looking back, I don't think there was, it wasn't like I saw a divide when I was a little kid between messing around in BASIC and making, I guess they're text adventures. It was just putting text on the screen. You'd say yes or no and it'd say some other text, right? There wasn't a difference, I don't think, that me and my friend Gareth used to see between doing that or playing a game on the Atari. It was just we'd go on the computer and mess around. I do remember at one point my gran bought me a comic book annual called Warlord Book for Boys, and it was all these World War II comic book stories, an annual of them. And in the back, it had 5 pages of basic code, and if you typed it in, it made this kind of Space Invaders thing, but you were a submarine and they're ships dropping depth charges on you. And I remember we sat there for a whole weekend typing all that into BASIC to make this game, which looked nowhere near as good as anything else we actually had on the Atari. So I think that was that started me off with being making games is kind of fun, making stuff that other people can play on being hey, play this thing, and they can play it on the computer is quite cool. But for all of being a kid, that was just something I had Click and Play as well, the drag and drop game making thing from Click Team, which interestingly, the newer version of that is what we made Not a Hero in. So I've been playing around with that for 20 years, I guess, or programs similar to it. But that was never something I thought would be a career. It was always something I just did as a hobby on the weekends, or to share with friends, or just for my own amusement, I guess. And that all kind of fell by the wayside. I got really into skateboarding and just school and uni and stuff, and didn't really make games for quite a while when I was in my late teens and early 20s. But it was when I was at university I started getting back into it again, because I'd learning a bit of Photoshop, and I had a friend that was doing Maya, so he was showing me a bit of Maya, how to make 3D models and things. And we used to just mess around, either texture editing existing games, that Kingpin Life of Crime game, opening all the textures up in that and drawing our own characters into the game and stuff. And it was through modding stuff, and then another thing by a program by the game creators called First Person Shooter Creator, which was a drag and drop FPS making thing. But it was really cool that you could drop your own 3D assets into it. I really got back into doing all that stuff kind of as I was finishing university, and then the first few years after university was just doing that, making weird little first person shooter games, but with my own crappy 3D assets. And that's how I ended up meeting Simon and Tom, who we then founded Roll7 together, because they were teaching young people, like teaching kids between like 13 and 18, like multimedia skills basically. So like film, TV, like website building, like Photoshop, like all of those kind of like digital media skills. And they wanted to move into video games, but they didn't know where to start with that, I guess. And it needed to be like a lot of the kids they were working with were kids who, you know, potentially had or were failing like maths and English GCSE. So like academically they were struggling, and they wanted to teach them like how to make video games and a bit of programming and stuff, but it needed to be simple, right? We couldn't just jump in with like, here's some C++, guys. So they posted on the forums for first person shooter creator being like, would anyone want to teach kids how to make games with this? And apparently I was the only person over the age of 15 that actually applied for the role. So I got it. And like that ended up being their company Rolling Sound was doing the teaching, right? And that video games course ended up being their most popular course. And so I got to know them like quite well, and we were trying to think what else we could do with games. And that kind of, I think at that point it was like before you could be an indie on Steam, right? And kind of make money, I guess. It's like, it felt like you needed a publisher. So I think we looked at like the world of like commercial entertainment video games and were like, well, we're not gonna go there. But because we had this sort of background in education, we thought like we could do educational games. And we ended up doing a project with some young people that we'd worked with in the other courses who really wanted to make a game about like knife crime, either because they'd been victims of or involved in gangs and stuff like that, and they wanted to make a game about that. And so we actually like pulled all of the people from all of the different Rolling Sound courses to make this little game. So like the music students made the music for it, and the film students wrote the script, and the games people made the actual game. Looking at it now, it looks super crappy, but also realizing how long we take to make a game now and being like, right, in 6 weeks we made this like 4-level 3D game with like cutscenes and all stuff, which was really cool. And I think that was the first point we were like, oh, like we didn't make any money, it wasn't commercial, we were funded to do it, but it was like maybe we could get funding from outreach groups or awareness stuff, whatever, to make games that engage people. And that's kind of the first time it was like, cool, I could work, you know, me and Simon Tom were like, we could work in making games, not necessarily like Call of Duty, but we could still get to do something as fun as making games, and earn a living from it. So I think that was like the first time, that was like the turning point of being like, oh, we're going to do, like, that's when we started Roll7, right? We were like, right, Roll7's going to make games for good and make educational games and stuff like that. And that was the first point we're like, right, this could be how we earn our living, I guess.
Yeah. Was it very different for you, going from what you were saying before, and you were kind of making games for fun, and the playing of the game and the sort of creation or designing of games wasn't necessarily two different things? Was it like a shock to the system almost to go from that, what sounds like quite a relaxed, like do it on your own time kind of thing, to what sounds like something that's much more structured and kind of deadline based? Like, did that change how you kind of perceived what game creation was?
Yeah, but I think it changes it for the better to a degree. So like on like personal projects, I've got tons of stuff, most of which I started and never finished. Even if it was like quite a good idea, it just doesn't get finished. There's a bunch of reasons for that, right? Like if you work on something on your own, it's a ton of work anyway. And obviously if you're doing something in your evenings outside of the thing you do to pay rent and buy food, like then it always fights with all the other things you want to do in your life. So it's quite easy for those things to fall by the wayside, right? And like when we first started out and we were like, you know, we did this one game about knife crime. We're like, cool, we're going to do games for good. And then we realized that actually not a lot of people want to pay money or get involved in making games for good. So we were kind of like, we kind of scraped around anywhere, right? Anywhere we could to get some funding to do something. There was games, so we like did stuff for. We did a game about employment for a college for like careers advice stuff. Like we did stuff with brain-computer interfaces for children with ADHD. Like we did all kinds of like crazy things. And what was interesting with a lot of those was there wasn't a lot of budget, right? It would be like with a marketing campaign, the company might want a whole bunch of stuff, which we also did just because we needed to get the contracts. We'd make a website and we'd do some promotional advertising banners and whatever. And then we'd also have like, you know, $2,000 of this budget to like make a little game as well. So it was really focusing because it would be like, right, you literally have 1 month to make this game and make it fun and it not have bugs. And it was at that point, it was me and one other guy called Ollie making the game. So it was like, I guess it's like if you go and do a lot of game jams, it kind of focuses you on like, how much can I get done in a small amount of time? So I think it was cool. Like there was a lot of time in experimentation when I just messed around as a kid, like trying 3D, trying 2D, learning programs, whatever, and learning, I guess, a lot about all the different bits of how a game goes together. But then when we actually started making games as a gun for hire studio, that was the bit where I think we learned how to focus and plan your time and scope something so that you can actually finish it rather than when you make a hobby project and you're like, it's going to be an online RPG and every single character will have their own lives where they walk around. And if I interact with them, I can like, and you start making it and I've got a spreadsheet and I've got one guy that can walk around a flat plane or whatever. And then, you know, eventually it's like, I'm just never going to finish this. So what's the point?
Yeah. So it kind of sounds like, you often talk to people and they certainly, independent studios that I've spoken to, there's, I mean, I'm not going to say it's a universal reaction, but there's sometimes a reaction when they talk about working as a like a contractor for another studio, that it's kind of, it's very sort of rigid and limiting. But it sounds like from what you're saying that it's actually the thing that kind of maybe taught you how to work within those constraints and then gave you kind of like the tools to then go out alone as Roll7, as doing your own stuff by yourself. Like, would that be like a fair comment?
Yeah, that's true. I think, you know, if you enjoy playing tennis, you can just go and hit a ball around with a friend every weekend, right? If you want to get good at tennis, you need to just stand there trying to hit a ball into the same spot every single time so that you get good at that shot. That's not necessarily fun. Playing a match of tennis kind of is fun. And I guess it's sort of similar with what we did. Like, I'm not making someone out, even if someone comes to you and goes, we want a game, and you come up with the creative for it and what it's going to be, and you put it to them and they go, great, we want you to make that game for us. It's still never your idea, and it's built in the constraints of someone else's kind of wants and needs. And then also, you know, they have a vested interest and input into what it ends up being. And so, yeah, it's good and it's focusing, and it, to a degree, it teaches you. And I think it's a situation that which was good to, an experience which was good to have had before, you know, before we got funding from Sony to do OlliOlli. We'd made games for clients, so we'd had that experience of like back and forth effectively with the people that hold the purse strings, and knowing kind of how to deal with that to a degree and what it's like to have a client. To say the flip side of that, when we actually started working with Sony, like we'd send them documentation, and initially we were like asking about stuff and putting things forward, and they were kind of going like, we're not your client, like this is your game, you can do what you want with it. And at that point we were still so used to having to make sure everything was okay with the person that was funding it. So it was a bit weird actually when we first got funded by Sony to have that freedom all of a sudden, that they were like, well, no, it's your game. Unless it's horrific, like it's your game.
Yeah.
We're not going to push you to do one thing or the other, you decide.
Yeah. Was that a surprise? Like, were you expecting that kind of relationship with someone with the kind of working at the kind of scale that Sony does?
So I think we always expected it was going to be different once we were like making our own game, like once it was ours, because I guess we touched on this before we actually started on the podcast, but like obviously it's our studio, so there is no one above you to go, oh no guys, that's a terrible idea, don't do that. Like every decision ultimately falls down to me and Si and Tom, whether it's something that should go in the game or whether there's time to do it, or whether we can bring another person on to cover that bit, or like whatever those things are. And that's actually quite scary, I guess. There are those bits where you're like, right, that's how the whole of the meta game is going to work. Like we're all agreed that that's good and we think that's going to work, and kind of everyone has to say yes, and that's like quite a weighty decision to make, and there's lots of those decisions to make. And it's, if you have a client, you propose all those things and you go to them and you go, this is what we're going to do, and they might feedback, or they might be like, brilliant, we're happy with that, and you're kind of no longer the responsible one, right? Because someone else said they wanted it. Whereas making games as we do now, you're making it because you hope somebody wants it. When it comes out, you hope that all those decisions you made are what people wanted, I guess. And that's different and a bit scary.
So when you're a small team, there's 3 of you that are founders of the company, 3 of you that are kind of the employees and the directors, as it were. And you're making these big decisions. You're a small company, you're not going to make any money unless you get up and do something. So when it comes to decision making and coming up with ideas and stuff, is there a natural split between you 3 in terms of the responsibilities that you take up, or do you kind of collectively come to a decision about lots of things? How does that dynamic work internally?
We all we take slightly separate, I guess, roles across the game. Like in any major decision, the 3 of us are always involved, and what's quite nice is there are 3 of us, so we kind of don't end up kind of bashing heads like you might do if there are only 2 founders, I guess. There's always a third person to kind of mediate and ultimately make the decision that means it's one thing or the other. Which obviously sometimes can suck if you're the person whose idea gets overruled, but it can also be nice other times when you're the person whose idea gets upheld by somebody else. So, on balance, I think that works quite well. And the lesson learned is most of the time in most of those decisions, if the right decision is obvious, we kind of all came to it. And usually when it's divided and we're battling, it's because neither of them are necessarily better. They're just different, and you've got to choose one of them.
Yeah. And was that always the case with that relationship, or did it take? I know you said Simon and Tom were working on Rolling Sound, and then you came in for the video games bit. Like, did it always feel like you were, how to phrase it? Like, were you always equal in the partnership? Was there kind of like a period of kind of adjustment before everyone trusted each other to the same extent in terms of making the decisions and all wanting the same thing and kind of trusting each other's ability to actually follow through on stuff?
So I think, well, initially Simon and Tom were my bosses because I actually went and worked for their company when they were doing the youth outreach stuff. And so when we started Roll7, they actually put some money into it to get it going and so on. And it was the 3 of us founded it, and I kind of was, I guess, at that time kind of bringing IP, I suppose, and ideas, and they were bringing like the business side of it as well. So I think in the early days, obviously, as I said, I worked for them initially, so I think I had to earn my stripes a little bit because they'd been in business together for like 6 years and they'd known each other since they were 4, and I was kind of the new person on the scene. Obviously, there was a transition period where that Roll7 and Rolling Sound were running at the same time as well. So there was a period where Tom was running Rolling Sound, the youth company, and me and Simon and Ollie, who worked for us at the time, were running Roll7. And so I think that was the point maybe with them where, well, I'm not going to lie, like I was pretty useless back then because they'd actually been running a company and running a business quite a long time, and I just sort of wandered out of university as this person who just liked sitting around making video games and going skateboarding. So, sitting down and doing a cash flow or a time plan for something or like managing other people was all like totally new to me. So they totally gave me a lot of leeway and I guess a lot of guidance as well in like how to manage other people and how to time plan and think about budgets and stuff like that, and cash flows and, you know, all those kind of things that come along with running a creative company. But I think it also, once we actually started making video games as opposed to like doing gun for hire and marketing stuff, once we started making our own games, I think it took us like OlliOlli, basically, the first game we did, to kind of find our places a bit. Like from my side, because like OlliOlli would be like, most of the games we've done have been like prototypes I've built that we've then played a bit, and it's been like that prototype, that's the thing we want to build, and then we go and build it. Hopefully someone wants us to build it. And so from that side, like I'm usually the one that's leading on kind of like the direction of the game and the design and the art. That's kind of always been the case, but I guess how much I get to lead on that is something that we've kind of found our place on. And Tom has kind of, I guess, emerged as production side and being very on it with time planning and talking to all the people that are working on the game and making sure we're on track and managing that kind of stuff. And Simon's been very much on like product and polish. So always wanting everything to be the best it can be. And not only that, but like, you know, what's the icon going to be? How's the trailer going to work? Like, how is this as more than just a game? Like, what makes it shiny and interesting, and kind of how do we sell it, I suppose. So I think it took us a little while to kind of like bed into those roles. Once we gets to the exit, the first game we did, the mobile game, that was just kind of a mess. That was just us scrambling to try and make a game that we thought was going to be quite cool without anyone kind of being like, right, you just deal with that and I'll just deal with this, and so on. OlliOlli, we kind of bedded ourselves in, I think. And then from there, I think we've been much better at like, you know, when you look at a problem being like, right, this is Simon's problem to solve. Obviously we all feed into it, but you lead on it. And we trust you to sort of lead on that thing. Yeah. I think it took us a little while to find that, but I think that's kind of natural anyway.
Yeah. Yeah. So when you're coming up with ideas, is that a, for want of a better term, like a kind of it's all a natural process whatsoever? Would it be, is it like a, you know, a divine inspiration? You just like somehow an idea strikes you and then you develop it, or is it like a sort of slower burn? Obviously OlliOlli's a skateboarding game, and you've mentioned the skateboarding interest, so there's an obvious link there, but do you have a sense of do you have a structure in terms of coming up with the ideas, I suppose, is the question, or are they kind of you know, in the most positive kind of way, are they kind of plucked from thin air?
So I guess like even though we now make games, I guess when you ask like how does it change when you start going from like a hobby project to a commercial project, like even though we're working like full time on, say, OlliOlli 2, because games has been my hobby, I kind of always need a side project, and it like might only be something I put like an hour into over a whole week, and just like, oh, I'm just going to set up the beginnings of a level editor, or like I'm just going to make whatever it is I feel like making at that point, right? Like some idea that's in the book of ideas that I'm like, oh, I feel like working on that. Because obviously like having those side projects is nice, because at times making games that you're going to ship is not a lot of fun. You're just kind of going through like the motions of getting to the next bit that needs to be done, or like getting through this iteration on the level or whatever. Like there is a lot of fun in making a game, but there's also a lot of like quite monotonous or tedious stuff that you have to do, right? And so it's still quite fun to then in the evening be like, I'm going to make a game about a cat that shoots lasers or whatever. So there's quite a few of those, right? There's a ton of kind of jam ideas that have just sit in a folder, and some get worked on more because maybe they're good, and others kind of sink to the bottom of the folder and never get touched again. And I think with all the games that we've done so far, although they all started as an idea I had and I made something rough that kind of got the idea across, and that was just picked from a conversation with someone, or it was just popped into my head while I was wandering along the street or whatever, and wrote it down.
Yeah.
All of the games have always then had input. So like OlliOlli, I gave Simon, like OlliOlli was originally on mobile, and I gave it to Simon, like on test flight or whatever it's called. And he went away on holiday and just like played it loads while he was on holiday, and was like sending me ideas, and we were like competing for the highest score. Like I didn't have online high scores, we just screenshot the high score screen and send it to each other. So obviously that idea then like grew from there, right? Like it was like feeding back a lot and being like, oh, this feels like you could do with that. Like it'd be really nice if this happened, or like could there be tricks if I flick my thumb in different directions or whatever. And like similarly, our current project, which I can't talk about, but the sort of genesis of that was like I'd built a prototype that I kind of quite liked, and me and Tom got stuck on a train back in Birmingham. Like it got delayed, and we ended up stuck on this train for like 3.5 hours. And we just ended up like playing that prototype on the train and being like, oh, it'd be cool if we did this. And like, oh, what if that wasn't quite like that and instead this happened and whatever. And so it's always been like, I think that's when we've known one of those prototypes is good, is like when I've shared it beyond just me making it in my room with Simon or Tom, and it's sort of started to spawn conversations about like where it could go and what else it could do. And like, it's kind of obvious that there's an enthusiasm from everybody else as well to like take it forward. Yeah. There's other games that I've been like, hey, I've been working on this, and shared it to them, and it's like, yeah, that's cool. Yeah. And like, they're kind of the barometer for like, is this a hobby project, or is this like, is this something like we could work on it? Like, if the two of them are enthusiastic to take it further, then I think that's usually a good barometer of whether it's like worth pursuing, I suppose.
Yeah. So do you show the other guys everything that you kind of make in your own time, or do you kind of self-censor yourself in a way and kind of just show them the stuff that you think might work as a Roll7 project?
I definitely self-censor. The Lollipop Man simulator where you try and get children across a freeway is definitely not something I pitched to them as a Roll7 project.
Well, you gotta come out now. You've made it public.
Yeah, it's actually out. You can get it. It's terrible. So no, like I think I also have quite that. There's a lot of stuff. Like I put things on itch recently because I was like, you know what, I'm probably not going to work on this anymore, but it would be interesting to see what people think. And there's other projects where I've like taken it to a point and realized I'm not interested in taking it further. So even if I showed it to them and they were like, oh, this is really cool, we could do something with it, I'm kind of like, I'm not interested in it. Because sometimes it's quite fun. I can't think of an analogy, but sometimes it's quite fun to be like, I'm just going to make an arena shooter. I've never made one before. Or like a while ago, I was like, I'm going to make like one of those Mode 7 racing games, like where the track kind of scrolls instead of it being an actual track, like back on the old like SNES. Yeah. I was like, I'm going to make a Mode 7 racing game. Like there is no market for this. It's never going to be a commercial thing. I'm just doing it because I want to see how the Mode 7 thing, how you make that. Yeah. So yeah, no, there's a bunch of stuff that just was definitely just for fun, sits in the folder. And then there's a few things I'm like, that could be really cool. Yeah, and they go forwards.
When you say it's interesting to see what people think on the kind of the itch releases and stuff like that. Is it how much kind of to heart, I suppose? How much do you kind of take any kind of criticism or feedback kind of seriously? I mean, do you kind of meditate on that stuff after you've read it, or is it a case of that the project was always kind of just for fun anyway, so it's not something you spend a lot of time like thinking about thereafter?
Sometimes it's really like, I guess a lot of the time with criticism on unfinished projects, the things that people criticize are generally the reasons why either you haven't finished it or you've gotten bored of it or whatever. Like I don't know, there's a snowboarding game I did which just isn't very fun to control, and it's like I can't think of a way to make it fun to control, but at the same time without that it's just a bit crap. And so you put it up, and I've had people email and be like, it's just horrible to control, And it's like, cool, your crit is valid, but I knew that. What's often interesting though is like the suggestions that people have. Like sometimes people are like, hey, what if it did this? And it's like, oh, that would make it way better, but I'd have to rewrite half the code for it to work like that. And again, I'm just not gonna bother.
Yeah.
But I think, sorry. I was going to say, like, I think Itch is putting stuff up on Itch like the end of last year and this year was actually a sort of scary reminder of how hard it is to actually just get anyone to play your game without some kind of marketing. I sort of don't mind if no one's played it. I'm not hoping it gets 1 billion downloads, but it was interesting to just put some stuff up and just tweet it and be like, I'll put it up. And be like, wow, I got like 100 downloads in like 3 months. If that was my project, I'd be a bit gutted.
Yeah. Is it nice to? It kind of seems like there's a parallel there between doing that sort of project and the stuff that you were talking about when you were building games when you were younger. Like you're just kind of doing it for the fun. Is that one of the reasons why you're interested in doing it? It kind of takes you back to that kind of more like the less pressurized kind of arena in comparison to making games that have to kind of make you a living and run the company.
Yeah, I think it's partly that, and I think it's also just a kind of like when I used to make games when I was a kid, like we didn't have the internet in my house until I was like 16, 17. So for most of the time that I made games, like unless you came over to my house, you didn't see them. I think once I put a game on, I made a game for someone, or I'd like made a game, and it was a friend of mine's birthday, and it was like only 1 megabyte, so I put it on a floppy disk and gave it to him as birthday present. And he was like, "Oh, aren't you going to give me a proper present?" And I was like, "Oh, I made you a game."
Yeah, I spent hours on
it. It was a crap game, but so I don't know. Like I think, yeah, to a degree, it's just actually wanting to put some stuff out. Like the sort of indie scene. Anyway, people share a lot of stuff, and that's not something I've ever really. It's been part of my game making, right? Like I've just sort of made things and I've sat on my computer. I shared stuff on forums a bit a little while ago, but I haven't really had a forum that I've been involved with. So I was kind of like maybe like Itch can be that forum, I guess. Maybe like putting out there and get involved with people. Which just sort of happened. Like there's a few other people that are on there that I've subsequently like met up with or spoken to.
Yeah.
So that's been cool.
Yeah. And when you say, I mean, when you come up with ideas, so let's take the Roll7 games as an example. When you're coming up with something like Not a Hero, is it a case that you want to make? The idea starts with I want to make a what is it, like a side-scrolling shooter in a way, or with OlliOlli, is it I want to make a skateboarding game? Or instead of that, do you approach it in terms of I want to make a game that forces like a certain kind of interaction or has a certain kind of pacing or a certain kind of difficulty level, and then you layer on like, okay, I'll add a skateboard in order to bring in that idea. Like which way round does it come, or is it neither of those things? Is it something else?
Well, the inspiration for those two games comes from two quite different places. So OlliOlli was a game that I tried to make when I was about 13 using click and play. And I could never figure out how to get the collisions to work so it could tell the difference between something you can grind and something you can ride on. And so I gave up. But if I still had my computer from whenever that was, 1995, like visually it looked almost exactly the same as the prototype that we first pitched to Sony. It just didn't play right. And so like that was just like I got back into like trying to make games. Like I had a bit of a break. We did it at work. So when we started Roll7, like that was, I sort of didn't make the games. We were doing a lot of stuff in Flash and HTML, and then we were doing a lot of stuff when we were doing brain computer interfaces, like just straight C++, and that was kind of all beyond me, or I was learning it, but not good enough to use it on stuff we were doing for clients. So I was kind of out of that side, and I was very much just on like design and visuals and that kind of thing. And so with OlliOlli, I got back into like, let's just make some games. And it was like, that's an idea I always wanted to do, and I think I know games a bit better. So I'm going to come back to it because it's always been in my head as something I thought would be cool. Just a skateboarding game where I can do a 180 and my guy faces the other way. Because I'd never played a 2D game where you could do a spin and land the other way, like a 2D skateboarding game where you could spin and land riding switch, right, the wrong way around. Mm-hmm. So that was the starting point, was like, I just wanted to do that. And in making that and having quite a janky landing system, that's then where the press X to land thing came from. And then it was like, that's the fun bit. That's the well, it's not, that's the super fucking frustrating bit, but that's the bit that makes it fun when you figure it out and you're like in that sort of flow state, I guess, where the rhythm is correct. So yeah, that one kind of just grew from that, I guess, going like that one mechanic is really fun. So everything now has to be built around that landing mechanic. Whereas Not a Hero was a totally different game.
Yeah.
Not a Hero was Jeffrey Archer before it was Not a Hero. Jeffrey Archer was basically like Spelunky with a bow and arrow, but nowhere near as good as Spelunky. But yeah, you just jumped around and you had a bow and arrow, so you kind of shot arrows at people a bit like Angry Birds style. So you pull the bow back and shoot, and then you have platforming. Yeah, and at some point I made a little man with a gun just because I was bored. Drew a man with a gun on the same sprite sheet using the same kind of character as I had in Jeffrey Archer, and then I put him in Jeffrey Archer and had him running around shooting Yorks, and was like, it's kind of fun running around and shooting things. It's a bit more immediate than shooting bow and arrow. And again, like I really loved Gears of War, and I really loved Kane and Lynch for like cover-based shooters. And to a degree, I knew I could never do a cover-based shooter on that scale. But I was like, maybe you could do it in 2D. Kind of maybe it could feel like elevator action, but it's got like a cover system, a bit like Gears, like duck behind walls and stuff. So yeah, it kind of grew from there. Like, let's just get that cover mechanic in. And then kind of that went in, and then the silliness came a lot later. All of the craziness of Not a Hero. That all came much later on when we tried to write a story and realised we were crap at writing stories. And so it'd be better if it was nonsense.
I don't think many people would make the connection between Gears of War and Kane and Lynch when they're playing Not a Hero, which kind of...
There's a move in Gears of War which is kind of really influential to the feel of Not a Hero. Like, you know in Gears when you run at a piece of cover and there's someone on the other side of the piece of cover and you've got the shotgun and you can slide in and stick the gun over the top and shoot and headshot them and kill them in one go. It's like this one fluid, like slide, pop, shoot, kill. Like, that felt so good to do. That was like one of the coolest things, and that was kind of like the Not a Hero thing of being able to like slide into a piece of cover and then critical hit someone straight on the other side, or like slide into someone, knock them down and then execute them on the floor in this kind of... I hoped I was trying to recreate the feel of the slide cover shotgun thing in Gears of War in just a variety of different ways through Not a Hero.
If you're interested in game design and game designers, then do make sure you check out Independent by Design, Art and Stories of Indie Game Creation. It's a hardback book written by us that combines inside stories that focus on specific studios and individuals, all of which is informed by tens of hours of original interviews, alongside compelling pages of original artwork and concept documents. Roll7 are featured, as are over 20 other studios and individuals that include The Chinese Room, Vlambeer, 11-Bit Studios, Dean Hall, and Tom Francis. Just go to indiebydesign.net to get your copy today. You can also follow us on Twitter at indiebydesign and on Facebook by going to facebook.com/independentbydesign. Our website, as well as being a portal through which you can listen to our podcast and buy our book, is also full of interesting editorial content for you to read. Again, that's at indiebydesign.net. We begin the second half of our chat with John by discussing the difficulty level that Roll7's games have thus far presented to their players.
OlliOlli is a hard game, and like we knew that before it came out. Like, we thought it was too hard when it came out, and I think it could have had more fans. I've met a lot of people who went, I played OlliOlli, didn't really get past the first world, but they really liked it, but it was just too hard for them. And I think like with OlliOlli 2, we tweaked some stuff, so it was slightly less punishing when you got a sloppy landing. And with Not a Hero, we definitely, well, like when we're talking about being critical of projects, with Not a Hero, I think we all felt like there's 3 worlds in the game, right? And the last world, difficulty curve, the spike is too high. Like the first world of the game, you don't have to be good at the game's systems. You can just shoot your way through like an idiot if you want. And to a degree, you can do it in the second world as well. And in the third world, it kind of goes like, nah, now you have to play properly or you're going to die all the time. And I actually think that was a mistake. Like when we look back at the game, I'm like, I think that game shouldn't have been hard. Like you should have been able to go from beginning to end pretty easily. And to get, to unlock like Megalord and unlock all of the kind of cool, harder to get endings, that should have taken the skill and the understanding of the underlying systems in the game. But we shouldn't have demanded of that of you in your initial playthrough. So I think there's actually been a softening in our sort of approach to that kind of stuff as we've gone on from OlliOlli forwards. And I think, I think we've been like, I want to make games more accessible. Like I want more people to be able to play it and have fun, but that there to be a high enough ceiling of skill in there that once you kind of discover the game and hopefully you get into it, that there is a lot of depth in the mechanics and in the systems for you to get really good at it. But initially you can still get in there and feel like a badass.
Do you think it's harder to build that kind of game that you're describing there, where you can go through, but there's also a kind of another level of complexity, of challenge if people want it to, or is it harder to build that kind of game than, say, a game that has a consistent, maybe more authored, for want of a better words, kind of curve that every player is going to experience in roughly the same way as every other player playing it?
I think that's really tricky, right? Because like if you look at something like OlliOlli, we'd always been like, the amateur levels are the levels that everyone can play and everyone can get through, hopefully. We might have been wrong. Maybe they should have been a little bit easier. But for the most part, you should have been able to get through all the amateur levels. And with the amateur levels, you only have to get to the end of level 2 to get level 3. You don't even have to do any challenges, right? But if you beat 5 challenges, you get a pro level. And what's really interesting in talking to a lot of players after it came out is people felt like they had to do all 5 challenges. Like, you don't have to. You can just go through and play all the amateur levels. But people like felt like they were missing out on the game, or that they weren't playing it properly if they didn't do all the challenges. So even with that, where we kind of went, here's the fun thing, and then if you want to put the time in, here's the other thing. Like, because it's a game and because you're coming to it cold and you just get it on your computer, you're like, oh, it's giving me this stuff to do, I'm supposed to do it. It's quite hard in a game to be like, hey, that stuff, don't have to do it if you don't want to. And as people making the game, it's like pro mode in OlliOlli is literally half the content we made, so we kind of want you to play it as well. So I do think that's a really hard balance. Either you've got to have an incredibly long game where it gets harder very slowly. So I had this chat with Graham, who you spoke to the other night, where he was like, I hate the fact that so many games kind of kick me out about halfway to 3/4 of the way through. Like, I'm enjoying it and I want to finish it, but it just gets too hard. Like, I want to finish the story and I want to see the end and I want to progress the character through, but the actual levels, what I'm actually playing, is just beyond my skill level at this kind of game now. But I think that's just the conundrum for video games a lot of the time.
I mean, I have that experience as well. Like, I think it's definitely one of the conundrums of video games. I think it's one of the things that kind of put off a lot of people from video games as something that they even might choose to spend as a kind of something to relax with in front of the TV or whatever, because often they're not relaxing at all, and you can't just go through and experience them in that way like you can a film or whatever. Not that I want to carry on the debate of comparing video games to films, but I mean, do you tend to play games that are especially challenging in that way? I know you mentioned Gears of War and that, but do you play other games that are, I mean, in your free time for fun, do you play games that have a kind of force a lot of interaction from you? Do you play games that are, more kind of casual and just sort of easier to get in and out of? I mean, what would you consider like your sort of go to game?
That's really hard. On my phone, I have a game called Platypus Evolution, which is just a clicker where you grow platypi or platypuses, whichever it is, which is like a stupid game. And I make games, and I know what this game is doing, but I'm still making platypi because it's cool. And I have a real soft spot for roguelikes, even though I never am ever going to finish a roguelike. Like Darkest Dungeon or Rogue Legacy, all those games, they all get me.
Mm-hmm.
Like I compulsively play that kind of thing, but I know I'm never going to finish them. And then, like, weirdly, I do quite like games like OlliOlli, like Super Hexagon and Hotline and those kind of things. But the weird thing with those games is it's like almost like understanding the floor of the stuff that we make as well, is like, I like twitchy, punishing, challenging games. Like Devil Daggers, right? It's like, you need to learn how to play this game. It doesn't have a lot to it, but you need to learn how to be good at it. Yeah. But I'm also aware a lot of those games just don't grab me. Like, I'll play it and I'm like, nah, I'm not going to put in the 9 hours required to feel like a badass. Yeah. But sometimes they do, and then I end up spending like all weekend on it. So there's that. Yeah. I think I understand that about our own stuff, is that a lot of people are like, yeah, it should be my kind of game, I just don't like it. But then, I'm playing Horizon Zero Dawn at the moment as well. Like, I'm pretty open to most genres. I've kind of been made aware of more stuff recently because my girlfriend works in games too and is into very different, I guess, genres of game than I would ever have really looked at before. So obviously, like, through playing games with her, I've played like Firewatch and oh my goodness, what's the game with the girls that say hello a lot and everyone goes back in time?
I have no idea what you're talking about, but
it's made by Don't Nod, and you play a girl called Alex, and she can be
Life is Strange. Yeah,
Life is Strange. So like those games, and I really loved. Like, a lot of the time, I just watched Holly play them, but I really enjoyed those games. They're not necessarily something I would have ever picked up and played. So I don't know. I think it's cool to have like a broad experience of all the stuff that's out there. It's just finding time to play it all, because there is literally so much now.
Yeah. Do you find it as a designer yourself? Do you find it kind of difficult to switch off when you're playing games made by other people, or are you always in kind of like designer kind of level awareness when you're playing it, and you're able to see like all of the kind of mechanical systems that are building up to the sort of overarching experience? Do you sort of compartmentalize it in that way when you're playing, or are you able to just kind of experience it as a sort of layman?
Well, before I made games, so before I did this as a job, I was still really critical of games I played, and I think that's true of like most of the gaming audience, especially we don't, right? But if we made online first-person shooters, the kind of people that are going to go and play an online first-person shooter have probably played a bunch of other online first-person shooters and have opinions about what it should be and how it should play. And they're not approaching it as a designer, but they're approaching it as someone who understands the medium. And so I think if you're someone that plays games, it's very hard to switch off your kind of like critical analysis of the thing that you're playing. Do you know what I mean? Like, you play Horizon Zero Dawn and you're like, oh right, there's a hunting thing for like wildlife and I get to craft with that, right? Cool, that system's in there. I know I'm going to have to do that if I want to get some of the stuff in the thing. And I don't think it's unique to game designers that you see that. Like, if you've played a Far Cry game and you play Horizon Zero Dawn, like, you obviously draw comparisons. Mm-hmm. So no, I don't think I switch off like how I think about games, but I don't think that necessarily changed a great deal when I started designing them. I think as someone who just played a lot of games, like, you're always critical of the stuff that you're playing and comparing it to other things that you've played. Did they do that as well as that other similar game or whatever? Yeah. Or going, wow, these people did something totally original. I've never seen this before. I wish I'd thought of that. God damn it.
That's the dream for everyone. And then to switch topic completely.
Go for it. Give me a recipe for chocolate brownies.
Yeah. This is the other podcast that I do. I haven't told you about. So you mentioned that you were working on the brain interface stuff, which isn't really something that I think most people would know really much about, and certainly nothing. It's not something that many people would have experienced firsthand. So, what did that consist of mainly? It's like, you know, you put a headset on and you think about moving something on screen, and then that happens.
I'm going to sound really critical of this now, but I don't mean to. But it is just our experience of having worked with this stuff is like they're electroencephalograms, so they're reading certain brainwaves in your head, but those sensors are very sensitive, so it's not always reading the brainwaves in your head. It might be reading the fact you moved your eyebrows or that you're talking, and so like it was a very challenging thing to use as a controller. Like obviously the first thing you think of when someone says like there's this thing you can put on your head, and if you concentrate you can change stuff in the game, or like if you relax you can change stuff in the game. So like I don't know, we sort of heard about this thing and I'm like, oh, this is cool, like we could like mod a first person shooter so that if you concentrate the target reticle like gets more accurate, and like the sort of health regen thing is like if I relax my health comes back, so if I'm stressed I don't recharge health as fast, that kind of thing. But it's just not that immediate, right? And it can be swayed by what you're doing, right? So saying like, oh, it's a first person shooter, if I concentrate I get more accurate. Well, by mere fact I'm playing a game, I'm concentrating, and so my concentration value is always quite high, so it's quite hard to kind of make that into a throttle for your accuracy. So it was really good fun, and we did lots of stuff where it was kind of like used passively. So we made like a vertically scrolling shoot 'em up where the more you concentrated, the more bullets you shot. So it was like a reverse bullet hell. Like if you could concentrate really hard, you just filled the screen with bullets and destroyed everything. And then if you lost concentration, you didn't shoot at all, and you just had to dodge like desperately until you could concentrate again. So that was like a really it was an interesting time, because it was like, you know, when we came to working with Sony and it was like, right, we're doing a game for Vita and no one's ever seen Vita before, here's a SDK, go. Like we had some experience of that kind of thing before, right? Like getting a weird new piece of hardware that we didn't know how to work with and sort of figuring it out. And the game that we did for Neurocog, which was a company that works with children with ADHD, we did a game to help kids with ADHD that was based around them doing kind of puzzles and it measuring how much they were concentrating while they were doing those puzzles. I'm not 100% sure how accurate the brainwave readings would be, because as I said, like it was a very sort of at the time, it might have improved now, who knows, but at the time it was quite a sort of finicky reading that you got. But we were really proud of the game we made. The actual bit, the game that you played was really cool, regardless of like whether the tech stood up to the challenge, I suppose. But it's certainly fun to get to work with some weird technology.
Yeah. Well, I was going to say, working with the Vita, even though it was a new platform at that point, must have looked, you know, positively kind of normal, and you know, compared to that. But yeah, no, it must be, yeah, what you were saying about the ADHD, I read a book recently about neurology. It's called Mind Wide Open, and he was talking about, the author of that talks about how they use games like that quite a lot in, well, he was specifically talking about kids that have been diagnosed with ADHD, and I can see like the potential benefit of that. But I don't know, like, do you think it's a realistic path for games to kind of continue to explore into the future?
As in games for health?
Games, no, just games for for kind of entertainment, I suppose. I mean, I can definitely see this in theory how it would work with the health side, but do you think it's a realistic, like, commercial proposition?
I think it has very similar pitfalls to like VR. Like, you know, if you play like a room space Vive game, you got to feel like standing up and wearing a headset and moving around and punching things or pulling levers or whatever. Like, there's a big difference between that and just sitting on your sofa holding an iPad playing like Fallout Shelter, or, you know, sitting in a chair playing PS4. Like, there's a bit more of a commitment to playing a VR game. And in a similar way, like with the brainwave stuff, if you ever sort of had to work late and you went out to the pub and had a couple of drinks and then came back to the office, like, you couldn't get reading.
Yeah.
So it's kind of that thing, like, you could have the headset, you could have a really cool game for it, but like you go out with mates and have a couple of drinks and come back to your place and you're like, oh, should we play that game? Like, no one can play it. It's all your brainwaves are messed up.
So a good spectator sport.
Well, you build the whole game around the fact that it uses brainwaves from drunk people. But yeah, I think it's like kind of any of the sort of newer tech things like HoloLens or VR. Like, I think it's a bit of a commitment at the moment, both financially and like you putting a thing on your head. It's a bit different from holding a controller.
Yeah.
So I think until they're more discreet, I think it will. I'm really wary of this, right? Because someone's going to go back and listen to this podcast in like 5 years' time, wearing some brainwave reading thing and some kind of holographic glasses, and be like, "What an idiot! It was only 5 years, and all of this happened."
Yeah. Well, in 5 years' time, this podcast will be streamed straight into someone's head, and they'll just
via one of those brainwave things.
There you go.
Yeah. So who knows? Like, it would be cool if they did.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, when you're talking about this stuff, the brainwave controller and the rolling sound educational work that you've done, and the projects on Itch. I mean, people know Roll7 for OlliOlli, OlliOlli 2, and Not a Hero, but there's so much other stuff that you've done and that you've been involved with. And I know we can't talk properly about the next project, but you know, I mean, I hope you're okay with me saying, you know, it's an ambitious project. Like, it's a I think most people would consider it, you know, like a big, certainly in terms of scale, like it's a real shift in comparison to what you've done before. I mean, was that always the goal, or is there a goal to kind of scale up what you're doing in that way and work on bigger and bigger projects? Do you have a long-term sort of plan in that sense?
So OlliOlli had like 9 people work on it, I think. And whoever I forgot, assume I included you and forgot somebody else if it's a different number. And then obviously, like OlliOlli 2, I think was like 14, 15 people. Not a Hero was like 3 full-time people and sort of 4 or 5 people freelance. So they're all quite small teams, but obviously we're a completely unheard of developer. And so like when we're talking to publishers, you know, it would be unrealistic to walk into Sony having never made a commercial game before and go, we've got this idea for this skateboarding game and it's open world and multiplayer and we need £3 million, because they just tell you to go away. So to a degree, like with the games that we've done so far, it's like we could get maybe this much budget, which is enough to do this thing we want to do. And, you know, I think you could talk to any developer that's ever gotten funding and gone, well, if they'd offered you 200,000 more, or they'd offered you 50,000 more, or if they'd offered you 5,000 more, no matter what it is, like, could you have found something to spend it on? I'm pretty sure everyone would say, well, yes, because I wanted to do this and this and this, and I just didn't have time or people or capacity or whatever, right?
Yeah.
And so I think with all the projects we've done, we've always wanted to be able to do more. And so, like, yes, the new project is considerably more ambitious than the last one, but in many ways, OlliOlli 2 is more ambitious than OlliOlli 1, and Not a Hero is more ambitious than OlliOlli. And also, like, I think as a studio, like, we've been the the biggest we've been is like 15 people, but the company that Simon and Tom ran, Rolling Sound, before we started had, I think it was like 100 employees. So from their side, they're used to running a company with a lot more people and much bigger budgets than we've had doing games. And then even like when Roll7 was doing gun for hire stuff, we ran some quite large scale, big budget marketing campaigns. So I guess in terms of the scope that we've had in games so far, what we're doing at the moment is bigger, but it's not like we haven't done a project at this kind of scale before, if that makes sense. It's just not been a game. And like, obviously games have this, we're on a podcast talking about games have this kind of like mystical, like these people go away into a place for like 2 years and then a game emerges and it's like magical. But a lot of the time, like running a game studio is not that different from running a youth outreach company or running any other company. There's obviously a creative side to it and there's challenges there, but a lot of the rest of it is management and time planning and all of that kind of stuff.
Yeah. So it sounds like the game might be different from what you've done before, but the actual wider scope of it isn't totally alien to you.
No, and I think like in terms of the studio goal or the plan, like for what we're doing now, like the scope and where we're taking it is kind of right for the game. And I think part of that is the reaction to the stuff that we've put out so far, where people have said, looking at it, I never would have played it, but my mate recommended it and actually it was really fun. Or, people who said, some lovely people who said I never would have bought this on the PlayStation Store, but I got it free on Plus and I really liked it, so I've actually bought it now because I think it deserved the money, which is really cool. But there's always that awareness in the back of your head that those people were averse to playing it when they looked at it initially. Like it didn't strike them as being fun. It wasn't something that they're like, oh, that looks sick, I want to try that out. And so I think, the ambition with this one is to get over that hurdle basically and hopefully make something which out of the gate looks like something that people want to play. But as I said, like where we're going with this is appropriate for this project. It's not necessarily like, from here we want to scale every project bigger and bigger and bigger, and eventually we want to be doing like Call of Duty or like BioWare scale projects.
EVE Online or something like that.
Yeah, no, I think like, the next idea could be a puzzle game, right? And we're like, this would actually be great on mobile, and like let's do a 2D mobile game. Like you could take that puzzle game and spend £3 million on it and turn it into like a 3D thing with procedural worlds or whatever, but it might just work best as a 2D mobile game. So I think like it really depends. The scope of what we do after this and like the direction we go is very much dependent on what the next game is, I think. Which is probably stupid. We should probably just make OlliOlli 3, shouldn't we?
For more on games and game creators, visit indiebydesign.net and follow us on Twitter @indiebydesign. The Indie by Design podcast is released every Wednesday and is brought to you by the writers and creators of Independent by Design, art and stories of indie game creation. It's a hardback book and it's available now via our website. Our next episode features Mode 7, creators of Frozen Synapse and Frozen Cortex and publishers of Tokyo 42. Music for this episode is kindly provided by Ben Prunty.